Let's talk about a territorial dispute that is very much in the news today, and that has to do with the events in the South China Sea. Now, what is this about? At its most basic level, this is a contest between China and several Southeast Asia countries over territorial control in the South China Sea. This includes some of the most strategically important maritime territory on the earth, and we'll talk about the reasons why. In essence, what we have here is numerous claims to the ability to exploit economically this region of the sea, and as we will talk about, a number of countries claim to have territory within the same area. To start with, we need to talk about the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. The 9-dash line is this line that appeared originally on old Chinese maps that intended to show the boundaries of China. And the existence of these maps gives to China the authority to claim that the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, the islands within this area, are Chinese. And if they are Chinese territory, then of course that raises very interesting questions as to who can control this area. Now, here we can see the overlapping claims into how the South China Sea is divided. The fact is, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we'll talk more when we talk about treaties, gives to countries exclusive economic rights depending on distance from the borders. And as you can see, if we apply that 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone provided by the UN Convention on the Land of the Sea, we see numerous overlapping claims of Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, the Philippines. Now, the 9-dash line, again, has appeared on official Chinese maps since the 1940s, sometimes called the 11-dash line, and it demarcates a vast but very vague stretch of ocean from China's southern coast throughout most of the South China Sea. China has never clarified the line's exact coordinates, but it sweeps across waters and a number of small islands that are claimed by 5 other nations. And some would argue that it goes miles beyond what's allowed under the United Nations Treaty on the Law of the Sea, which China is a member of. Now, these are the areas where China has been building islands or reinforcing islands that are already there, installing military runways and running naval patrols. For China, this 9-dash line represents a long lost historical claim that the country, after 2 centuries of relative weakness, that it is now finally strong enough to recover. So for China, this marks a return to historic Chinese regions. For the other nations, of course, the line is a symbol of what they would characterize as a power grab by China. Now, here's a map of various military installations that are already present in the South China Sea. You can see Filipino installations, Malaysian, a number of Vietnamese and Chinese are already there. It's a heavily militarized area. In July 2016, an arbitration panel ruled in favor of the Philippines. This was an arbitration panel constituted under the authority of the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it ruled against the Chinese claims in the region. Now, however, it is important to note that China did not participate in this arbitration, so it was a bit of a one-sided affair. China insisted that the Convention on the Law of the Sea did not extend to matters of sovereignty, and that's what the arbitration panel was in effect deciding. Now, the tribunal did not rule on the ownership of the islands or delimit maritime boundaries, and China has always stated that while they did not recognize the arbitration panel's ruling it did insist that the matter could be resolved through bilateral negotiations with all of the claimants. You may be wondering, why is the South China Sea so important? Well, there is a core contradiction in the South China Sea dispute. It's driven by territorial competition, yet all the countries that are involved are trading companies and want open sea routes. Everyone benefits from the free flow of goods between Asia and the rest of the world, and everyone would suffer if that is disrupted. This is part of why the United States is become so involved in seeking freedom of movement. It's very unlikely that China would ever want to close off trade, but the United States would prefer not to allow Beijing to even have the ability to do so. China, on the other hand, is concerned about American naval dominance, and that suspect that the United States has the ability to shut off trade. So it's hardly surprising that China also seeks greater control over these waterways that it relies on for economic survival. Here's a map of the regions the exclusive economic zones provided by the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And as you can see, up to 12 nautical miles, there is exclusive control of both the airspace above the water itself, and the region below that. Extending from 12 miles to 200 miles, there's an exclusive economic zone in which there is permissible international transport across the region. However, the area of the continental shelf would be exclusive to the economic control of the neighboring country, and the fishing is also available. High seas out on international waters, of course, everything is open. Now, the area is rich in oil and natural gas deposits. Now, some would argue that it's not as rich as what was previously claimed. Some have originally stated that the South China Sea was essentially the next Persian Gulf, but in fact, that may not be true. Nevertheless, there are certainly significant oil and natural gas deposits in the region. Here's a guide to show you pre-existing oil and gas fields. We already know that these exist, and you can see the effect of the territorial claims by the surrounding countries in terms of who has rights to that oil. Of course, some would argue that it's fish, not oil, that's at the heart of the South China Sea conflict, that this instead is about fish and the ability to fish in the region, and the fear that one country will take advantage and overfish the region to the disadvantage of the bordering countries. In any event, we know that there have been clashes between naval vessels and fishing boats over their rights to fish these waters. And finally, we talk about this area is one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. At least 270 merchant ships use this route each day. More than half of the tonnage of the world's crude oil is transported by sea through the South China Sea. And of course, as China needs more oil, and South Korea and Japan all increase their consumption of oil, that will increase the flow of these ships. This traffic is 3 times greater than that goes through the Suez Canal, and 5 times more than the Panama Canal. So obviously this region is heavily dependent on the free movement, of ships and goods through the region. And of course, why does it matter to who controls the trade routes? Because again, we can see that this oil passes not just to Asia, but on to Australia and to South Korea and to Japan, which are all highly industrialized economies. You may be wondering, why is the United States so involved in this? The United States doesn't have any installations in the area. They own no property. Well, the United States does have a treaty obligation to the Philippines. They are an ally. One could also argue that as the world's largest economy, the United States has an interest in maintaining open sea lines, and therefore, as the world's biggest naval power, it often assumes the role of policing those sea lanes. But also, this is really about the United States' attempt to shape the sort of power that China becomes, that there is concern within the American government that China will not work within what has commonly called the liberal order, the post-war system of international laws and institutions. And so there's a fear that China's influence will grow and thereby reduce American influence. This is really a test case of whether China becomes the kind of power that it wants, or whether it becomes the kind of power the United States wants. We know that China is seeking to assert itself. During one of the recent flare-ups over the disputed South China Sea, China actually encouraged its Chinese celebrities to each tweet out a picture of China, and of course the picture would include the South China Sea. This picture also gives you a relative idea of how large of a region this is, given that this is the rest of China. We know that the Chinese have attempted to increase the territory available in the South China Sea through these dredging operations like we see here. There's definitely been an effort to increase the size of the area. We want to ensure, the Chinese would like to ensure that this will count as territory. The rules state that if a region is in order to constitute territory, the region must be above water at all times, and in fact, this dredging operation will make sure that that's possible. There have already been disputes between China and the naval vessels of the United States, which are very often in the region. And recently we saw Japan also intending to deploy warships to the South China Sea. This was in August 2018. So you can see this area and this region continues to be very controversial, and we still have not resolved this matter, and probably won't be resolved for a while. So this discussion of the South China Sea should give you an indication of the importance of international law and how relevant it is for the work that we're doing right now in this class. Thank you.